Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we start to take a look at the money games from the US Chess League's 2007 Game of the Year Countdown Contest. So, number 5 was a game that I picked at number 2, and it was played between Vinay Bhatt and Hikaru Nakamura. And this is from week 3 in a San Francisco versus New York tussle. It's a very long and interesting game, and what I would say led me to rank it a little bit more highly than some of the other judges, and interestingly more highly than a game that was pretty similar, the 6th place game between Perelstein and Charbonneau, is the kind of David and Goliath bit here. So there are a lot of things that are similar though. So there's, it wasn't an overly accurate game at certain moments, and it was a long game, and at the end it required some good technique by the winner to pull it off. And from a position too where it maybe wasn't entirely obvious that it would be a win. But I think the reason why this is a little bit more interesting to me than the other game is that the victim is Hikaru Nakamura, and it's almost a 300-point upset. So I think that is probably what inclined me to value this game more highly. So it's certainly not that Perelstein isn't a very good player. So he's a grandmaster himself. But okay, we're talking about one of the best players in the world. Not quite in the Linares crowd, but I think maybe around the top 30 or so, or at least getting there pretty quickly. So at any rate, they're both very exciting games. I would say that's the other thing too, is I think this game on the whole was much more dramatic and had a lot more back and forth than the previous week's game. So that one, the trend was consistently in Charbonneau's favor, and it was just a matter of whether he would actually win it or not. This one, you've got some real back and forths going on, and both games were exciting as spectacles for those who were watching live. But I think this one also plays better for those who weren't there at the time. In any case, I'll stop giving an apology here in the classic sense for my judging of the two games, and let's take a look at the game itself. All right, so Bhatt has white, and remarkably, we have this whatever it is opening. It's classified as a Schmidt-Benoni, but it's not a Schmidt-Benoni. This is a position that I think I've played, I'm sure, between 50 and 100,000 games in my life. Of course, counting blitz, not tournament games. And I'm pretty sure that I've never had this position in any of my games. But in the 20 games we've looked at this year, this is the third game that features this position. So it's pretty remarkable. The first game that we saw with this was Bonin against Molnar. That was game 17 in the countdown, and that game saw knight to e4, queen d3, takes, g6, queen b5. And I believe Bonin won the game, but Molnar was actually at least equal as far as the opening was concerned. Okay, the next time this showed up was in week 14, and this was from the Tangborn-Kuljasevich game. And I don't remember. Oh no, Black won that. Yeah, it was actually a pretty nice game, but Tangborn seemed to be a little bit cooperative there. So at any rate, we've got a third game and a third move here. So Nakamura played queen to a5 check, which seems at least more in keeping with the kind of quasi-Trompowsky feel of the position. Okay, white played c3, knight e4, bishop h4, b4. Now here, the usual move, and probably better move, is queen to c2. I mean, it's not like this has been played lots of times, but the position has arisen with some pretty strong players. So queen c2 was played by Boris Kogan, who was a very strong player, died a few years ago. Grandmaster strength player, though I don't think he ever got the title. Epishin, who's a strong grandmaster, has played this. Vladimir Tukhmakov, another strong grandmaster. And although he wasn't a grandmaster at the time, Topalov played this move also. So, impressive footsteps, but Bhatt went his own way and played c4, which is almost a novelty. Now, it's a nice move to play, in principle, I suppose, but there's this discover check, which at least throws a little disarray into the white camp for the moment. So what we end up with is kind of a declined Benko sort of setup here as far as the queenside pawn structure is concerned. So knight b to d2, ba, queen b3. And now in the one and only earlier game in which this was seen, Black played knight takes d2, and only then knight takes a6. And all right, the general positional contours were actually pretty similar, and that game ended up drawn. But it was between players who were significantly lower rated than Bott and Nakamura. Okay, so Nakamura played knight to a6 straight away, and of course he'd like to put the knight on b4, protecting the pawn. So naturally Bott takes it, queen b4, and now we end up with this exchange anyway. Okay, and now something I didn't think about at the time when I was preparing my notes, but as I look at it now, it strikes me that maybe g6 would be better, but maybe it won't make a difference. It's hard to say, because I mean, rook a4, queen b6, queen c3, and I think black will be faced with a similar choice to what he had to decide on in the game. So anyway, he played d6, rook a4, queen b6, and now Bott makes a good move. He plays queen c3, making it difficult for black to seize this long diagonal. I mean, if he does seize it, I mean, let's say white plays kind of cooperatively with something like e4, g6, bishop e2, or whatever, bishop g7, castles. Here, black has very nice play on the diagonal. In fact, maybe you can just take the pawn, so probably b3 or something like that needs to be played. Okay, so castles, castles, and castles. And black is going to get nice play on the queen side. I mean, this bishop sweeps through here. The knight has access to the b4 square, which is quite good. And the b file, of course, whichever rook chooses to use it, is also going to give black some quite nice play. So white is well advised to make it as difficult as possible for black to get this ideal kind of Benko gambit / modern Benoni sort of pressure on the queen side. And so queen to c3 is a nice step in that direction. Now, that's prophylaxis, but what is white going to do positively? Well, again, this being kind of a Benoni-ish pawn structure, white's principal aim is going to be, at some point, to try to achieve the e5 break and grab a lot of space and potentially convert this into some kind of kingside play down the road. So queenside play is really not in the offing for white. I mean, even if he does double on the a file, it's going to be kind of a one mover. The knight moves away, the a pawn will be safe, and he's got more serious problems with his b2 pawn, and even the c4 pawn in some situations can prove to be a chronic weakness. So it's not that it's in any immediate danger. It's defended 3 times, and will be defended a 4th time when the e pawn goes up, but just in terms of the structure, it's going to be the base of the chain here if the b pawn goes, and as such, potentially quite easy to attack. Okay, so anyway, here black has some decisions to make here. Clearly he wants to play g6 and bishop to g7, but of course he can't do it right away. So how should he prepare this? Should he play rook to g8, g6 and bishop to g7, or something else? In the game he chooses something else, but I don't know if it's the best way to go or not. Also, he could have maybe played rook to b8 first, just gain the useful tempo here after b3. Okay, then maybe rook to g8, and now play g6 next. And I would say this is roughly balanced. White's going to have a nice advantage in central space. Black is going to have, again, good pressure on the queen side. All right, instead of rook to b8, or more generally the rook to g8 idea, Nakamura chose f6. And this looks really strange. I mean, okay, now he's going to be able to fianchetto and he can still castle, but isn't he creating a kind of a gruesome hole here on e6 and weakening his light squares in general? Well, he is, but the castling privilege perhaps should not be underestimated, so that's pretty important. And the second thing is that it helps to also fight or fight against the e5 advance. At least he has the potential of using it to that aim. And the third point is that this pawn may get advanced to f5 at some point, and in that case there wouldn't be any, let's say, extra weakness caused by playing f6. I mean, the same weaknesses that he would get from f5 he's going to get by doing it in 2 moves. So while it looks aesthetically really kind of ugly, it's very well motivated and certainly not a bad move. Okay, so Bott continues quite naturally with e4, g6, f4, And here it might be worth considering for black bishop to h6 rather than bishop to g7. So bishop h6, gaining a tempo, hitting the pawn after bishop to g3, castles, let's say bishop e2, and now f5. And this looks reasonably promising for black, maybe even slightly in his favor. If white takes on f5 or allows black to make the capture on e4, then there's going to be some pressure against his pawn on f4, plus black's light squared bishop very much comes to life. On the other hand, if he plays e5, black may have the opportunity to exchange on e5 and then push his f-pawn. So black is getting very active play here and doing it quite nicely with gain of time. So that might be a slight improvement over Nakamura's choice, which was the immediate bishop to g7. Okay, bishop e2, both sides castle, and now there it is, f5. Alright, so it took him a little extra time, and he's got a weakness or two on the e-file. The e7 pawn is weak, of course, and the e6 square could be weak, but the long diagonal is pried open, and depending on what white does, many more lines can open up as well. So white plays e5, which is the obvious and natural, and not bad move either. So he keeps the f-file shut, he keeps the bishop on c8 from coming out to a square like f5, and he's closing the bishop on g7's diagonal as well. However, this pawn on e5 is under serious pressure here, so of course it's attacked by the pawn, it's attacked by the bishop, it can be attacked by the queen, and after something like rook to e8 and e6, there's the idea of taking on d5 and adding still more pressure to this poor pawn on e5. So whether that pawn is a strength or a weakness, maybe both, remains to be seen. Alright, well Nakamura, of course, plays rook to e8, defending the e-pawn and preparing the e6 idea. And I should point out, I mean, of course, white's threatening to play bishop takes e7 as well, so it's and the f-file is going to remain closed for the foreseeable future, so there's no reason for the rook to remain where it was. So rook e8 is a good move. Here, white again has a choice. He can play. Well, there are a lot of things he can play, and each has kind of a different purpose. So one way to continue is with rook f to a1, going for queenside play. So to try to turn it into a little bit of a race. And this is also a prophylactic move too, because on e6, d takes e6. If rook takes e6, so let me actually just demonstrate this. Okay, so e6. Oops. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Alright, if e6 here, d takes. Okay, bishop takes is impossible because the knight's hanging. And if rook takes e6, then there's bishop to f3, hitting the rook, but also threatening bishop to d5, taking advantage of the pin here. So there's that idea, and if knight to b4, maybe rook to a5, which makes d takes e5 at least a little bit more double-edged because there's the possibility of the pawn on c5 hanging. Also, maybe in some positions, white might consider rook to b5, and maybe even sacrificing the exchange to get the c-pawn as part of this big central mass. So that would be an interesting way for white to proceed. In the game, he chose bishop to f3, and this is also a prophylactic move against e6, because, of course, he would just take on e6 and discover an attack on the rook in the corner. So Nakamura plays rook to b8, getting out of the way of that trick and hitting the b-pawn. White plays b3. Black plays knight to b4. Rook e1. Okay, so the other nice point about this, going back here, is that bishop to f3 is not just prophylaxis in the direct sense, but it's a useful defensive move because it clears the e-file with tempo. So there we go, rook to e1. Alright, now it might be worthwhile for black to play bishop to d7 first, and after kicking maybe play queen to c7. So just taking a little bit more of a patient approach. But Nakamura decided to set the whole board on fire here with e6. And this really makes the position quite confusing. I mean, you have so many different captures to calculate that it's easy to get lost. And it's also easy whenever there's a situation that's full of tension like this to look for some way to resolve it, even if it's not best. I mean, well, there are very few players who have the patience to just accept pawn tension like this indefinitely and not try to find some way to resolve it. All right. Well, here, Bot maybe could have played bishop to f6. This probably is not a bad move, inviting the exchange. So first of all, it protects the pawn on e5 by, of course, getting in the way of the bishop on g7. But again, the exchange of bishops would be favorable for white, especially if the position opens up, as it looks like it could. So this, I think, would give Bot some advantage. In the game, he played rook a to a1, and this is also, well, it's intelligible because this rook on e1 is loose in some variations. And all right, well, I mean, I'd say that's the main virtue. So he's just connecting the rooks, and the rook might also prove useful on the d file in some lines too. All right, Black played bishop to b7, increasing the pressure on the on white's center, and also connecting his rooks too. All right, so at this point, the pawn tension finally gets resolved. So d takes e6, de, fe, rook e6, bishops get traded. Now knight f3, so the pawn stays well protected. Knight c6, and here we start to see some inaccuracies. So the game's been pretty accurate up to this point. Now the game gets a little bit sloppy. I mean, not bad though, but just a little bit, and that's to be explained by Bot's severe time trouble. And unfortunately, from Nakamura's point of view, I could say that both sides' mistakes were explained by Bot's time trouble. And in fact, in a couple of moves, so not just yet, but I think after Bot's 29th move, this is move 28 coming up here, he was down to a whopping 58 seconds. And Nakamura had 23 seconds, but also 71 minutes. So a colossal disadvantage, or a colossal difference in the amount of time that the players had left. And so I think, you know, Nakamura got a bit careless trying to maybe put Bot over, and it just didn't work. All right. Well, here again, I think the best move for Bot is bishop to f6. Now this gives up the b3 pawn, but it seems to be okay. So queen takes b3. And now another very good move, queen to d2. So the idea is to play queen to d5 or queen to d7 with very dangerous initiative. Okay, so queen takes c4 is playable because it protects the rook, but still, takes, queen d7, rook a to c1, and here Black has to play very accurately to be okay. So the only good move here for Black is, in fact, well, maybe you can try to find it. So you're invited to stop the recording at this point and see if you can find what Black should play here. Okay, well, the move is queen to g4. So a very nice move. And the point is that if White grabs the rook, rook to b2 gives Black a very serious attack. Knight h4 is the only move. And now not queen takes h4, but knight to d4. So adding fuel to the fire here. And again, White has to play very resourcefully just to stay alive. Knight takes f5 check. Knight takes f5. So that's the idea. We just force one of Black's pieces away from the danger area. So knight takes f5, queen d5, knight h4, queen e4, rook g2, and now king f1 is the only move. If king h1, how does Black win here? So another little puzzle for you. Okay, the answer is rook to g1 check. So very nice little tactic. Rook takes g1 is the only move. And then queen takes e4 with mate next move. So after rook takes g2 check, White has to play king f1. And after this sequence here, this endgame that we have is, I would say, clearly better for Black. I don't know if it's a win, but it certainly has good chances to win. But you know, I wouldn't bet on it. So it's certainly merits further analysis. If Black can win the e5 pawn for free, I mean, of course he's losing the a pawn, but otherwise for free, then he's definitely winning. But and if he wins the e pawn for, let's say, his h pawn, he has good winning chances. If his king can get to d4, for example, without losing anything like the g pawn, then I would say he's winning. So in any case, certainly Black has good winning chances here. Whether it's enough or not, I don't know. Alright, so going back here after queen to g4, white's best move is just queen to d2 check instead of taking the rook. After f4, rook takes c5, and this is a very, very unclear position. Black's up a pawn, but white's e-pawn is quite strong. His pieces are pretty well coordinated. The f4 pawn is a little bit loose, so I think white has adequate compensation for the material here. Alright, so that's what would happen on bishop to f6, or at least what could happen. In the game, Bot played bishop to f2, and now Nakamura, I think, again, should have just taken on b3. So he does lose the c5 pawn here, in this case, but after rook to c3, it seems that he at least has a small edge. But Nakamura is very much a maximalist. I mean, I'm sure he considered this and decided that it was probably too drawish and that he would have better winning chances by keeping more stuff on the board. So he played queen to e7, protecting the e5, the c5 pawn, and also adding to the pressure on white's e pawn. All right, now here I think white's best move is bishop to h4, just kicking the queen away, and then can retreat to f2 next move. All right, instead he plays rook a to d1, which is a natural centralizing move, but it does give up the pawn, more or less for nothing. I mean, the resulting pawn structure is such that white still has very good chances to hold the position. I mean, black's queenside pawns are quite weak, but still, this is a concession that white didn't need to make. But as I said, Bot was down to 58 seconds after this move, and at least they're playing with 30-second increments, so he was down actually 28 seconds when he made the move, and the clock kicked up to 58. And most of the rest of the way, that's about where he was. So, I mean, occasionally he approached, I think, 2 minutes on a couple, 2 or 3 moves, but basically he was just living off the increment the rest of the way. And that's about another 50 moves, so it's pretty impressive that down a pawn here, and against one of the best players in the world, certainly one of the 2 or 3 best players in the country, he managed to hold on here, and in fact take over, as it turned out. Okay, so takes, and again, if we just trade off too many things, the game is going to be too drawish. So this I think, even if he loses the c pawn, which is reasonably likely, Nakamura should be able to, or I'm sorry, Bot should be able to hold this fairly easily with all the pawns on one side. Okay, so instead of queen takes e5, Nakamura played bishop takes e5. Now I think the best move here is queen to f3, trying to use the queen to complement the bishop rather than supplement it. So instead of turning them both into glorified bishops, I think turning them into maybe something more like the bishop pair would have been a slightly better approach. But again, with so little time, natural moves are going to be played, whether they're the most accurate or not. Okay, now here, black plays bishop to d6, defending the pawn. And, okay, again, what can we say about this ending? Black has these weak pawns on the queen side, which makes it tough for him to convert the advantage. But still, he's got to try. It's a relatively clean extra pawn on the king side. So what he needs to do is consolidate, because there's, with this open diagonal here, this gives white a lot of perpetual check and just general attacking possibilities that would be almost completely absent if the pawn was back on f7. So this is where a lot of white's counterplay is going to come from, and for black to neutralize that without returning the extra pawn and then going on to make progress is pretty tough. But, of course, Nakamura is going to try. Okay, so white played queen to d3, and we ended up on f3 after all. Okay, now here, maybe Nakamura should play queen c7 to induce g3, and then play bishop to f8. But still, after rook to d5, I mean, the position is pretty even. I'm sorry, not pretty even. I mean, still a little bit better for black, but white's not doing too badly. All right, but I still think this would have been the best way, trying to neutralize white's use of the d file. All right, in the game he played a6, and this is pretty sensible too, getting the pawn off of the dark squares, so that way if there's some kind of exchange, let's say black wins the b3 pawn and white wins the c5 pawn, the a7 pawn isn't hanging at the end of it, as we saw in the variation a few moves back with, well, back here. Oops, with queen takes e5, right? So we saw this sort of line. So by playing a6 in this position here, black is avoiding that. And he's also getting the pawn off the 7th rank, which means that if white plays queen to b7 at some point with check, there won't be queen takes a7 necessarily as a follow-up. Of course, there could be queen takes a6 as a follow-up, but just pointing out that there are positions where it could be either way. It doesn't have to be queen to b7 check. It could be queen or rook anywhere on the 7th rank check, followed by taking on a7. Okay, so that's been removed. All right, white plays rook to d5 here, centralizing and adding to the pressure on c5. Queen c7. And it looks like the idea is to play what maybe he could have tried earlier, which is this. So bishop b7, f6. All right, and of course he's also threatening the pawn on h2. So I think the best move would have been h3 here. And I like this better than g3 because even though it doesn't, let's say, cure the back rank problem for the moment at least, because h2 isn't a flight square for the king, it does prepare g4, which could, it opens the board up, and it opens it up on both sides, for both sides, but I think that white has enough protection around his king that he won't get mated, while black may not have enough protection around his king to avoid perpetual check, or at least to avoid perpetual check if he tries to engage in activity on the queen side. All right, in any case, white played queen to c3. And this is a perfectly good move too. Okay, so king f7, g3, and now here, though, I think black should play bishop e7. So if he can get his bishop on that diagonal, then he doesn't have to worry about, well, he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. His king can be pretty safe on g7, and the bishop's not too badly posted on f6 in some lines either. Okay, so white can choose between a couple of moves. Let's say he plays rook takes d8, queen d8, and now if queen to a1, which looks pretty good at first sight, hitting the pawn on a6, and keeping the back rank covered, and in some lines the queen can go to e5 or to h8, so h5. And now if queen a6, check, here takes, and as it turns out, white's queen is badly decentralized, so if he could get his queen, if the queen were here on d5, then white would have no problems whatsoever. But with the queen on a6 and kind of stuck away from the center, here he does have problems. So, for example, let's say h4, queen c2, queen b5, queen e2. So again, preventing white from bringing his queen back. King g1, and now f4. And in this kind of position, again, notice that white's queen is stuck. It's very difficult for white to hold this, because this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, and the position of white's king is kind of exposed as well. Alright, so going back here, instead of queen to a1, which looks good but decentralizes perhaps fatally, queen to e5 seems to be best. Okay, nevertheless, black still gets his queen to this nice central square, so even here it's not really clear that white is fully okay. And if queen takes a6, queen b1 check becomes the same thing we saw. Alright, so that was on bishop to e7, rook takes d8. Okay, queen d3 is also possible, but again I think we end up more or less in the same place. Queen d6, and white's queen either has to give ground or exchange, or allow the exchange. And again, this is probably not so good for white. And notice, by the way, that this pawn formation with the pawns on g3 and h2 is not as good for white as the h2 g3, or sorry, g2 h3 configuration would have been. Then the pawns wouldn't be targets. All right, here though they need to be babysat a little bit. All right, so anyway, after bishop to e7, I think Bot would have been in some trouble. All right, after rook to e8, I mean, okay, black is still better, but it's less concrete now. Okay, queen a1, now queen a5, tripling up on the c-pawn, and now queen to d2. So very nice maneuvering by Bot. I mean, gotta like that triangle here. Right, so we start off with the queen on c3, goes to a1, a5, d2. And from here, it's not only helping with the threat to take on d6, but could also end up on h6. Also, if the rook goes to d8 here, well, white just plays queen to a5 perhaps, and we're just repeating the position here. So this is no good for black. So Hikaru played bishop to e7 here, but now rook to d7. So all of a sudden white is getting a little bit active here. His pieces are getting a little bit frisky, and black has to be a bit careful. I mean, his king is kind of perpetually exposed. So I know he's trying to take some risks here because he's trying to avoid various drawing scenarios, but you know, it's a fine line between appropriate and excessive risk. All right, now here I think rook to b8 would have still been good. Not good enough to win, but it at least restricts white's counterplay. So rook to d3, rook b6. And here you can see that black is doing a pretty good job of keeping white from perfectly coordinating. But even so, there are just so many gaps in black's position, and he doesn't really have enough pieces left to plug them all. And meanwhile, white's king is quite safe. So anyway, in the game, Nakamura played king to e8, and this kicks the rook out, but only for a moment. So rook to d5, king f7, and we come here again. All right, so after rook to b8, we're back to where we could have been. Here, queen to d3 happened. All right, now notice that black can't play rook takes b3 because of rook e7. All right, so that's not available just yet. But, you know, tricks like that you have to keep your eye out for. All right, instead, black played rook to b7, offering the trade of rooks, and of course kicking the rook off of the 7th rank. Rook to d5, and now a5. If he tries queen to b6, actually this is a good moment here. So queen to b6 looks at first glance extremely strong, threatening the b3 pawn. So this guy looks like he's a goner. Well, what should white do here? So again, another place to stop the recording. Put on your thinking caps and see what you can find. Okay, well I hope what you found was the nice tactical shot, rook takes c5. After bishop takes c5, white has queen to d5 check. After king g7, bishop takes c5, queen b3, queen e5, and white has perpetual check. And there are a fair number of lines where if black isn't even careful, he can even lose. So white's bishop is doing tremendous work. Black's king is quite exposed, and you can see, I mean, he's got nothing supporting him on the dark squares. So it's almost fortunate that black isn't losing here, but white does at least have a draw. So queen to b6 is no good for that reason. Instead, he played a5. All right, so now the queen still has control over the d5 square. So queen f3, threatening rook f5, queen b6. And now, here, Bot could have done it and forced an immediate draw, which he would have, I'm sure, been happy to do at this moment, but in retrospect, wouldn't have been. So again, the same thing. Well, bishop c5, check, takes, queen e5 is drawing. And, oops, and if queen takes b3, so just ignoring the free gift, well, white regains the pawn. It has still a perfectly good position. This is at least equal. Maybe, probably at most equal, but it's equal. Black has nothing at all here. Okay, instead, Bot played g4. And this is a quite brave decision. I mean, he could have played rook to d3 to simply defend the pawn, and, you know, Nakamura hasn't really been proving any progress here, so he could have done this with safety. But instead, I mean, very gutsy decision with only about a minute on his clock, and Nakamura, I don't think Nakamura ever fell below an hour for the whole game. I mean, so he was almost, you know, playing on the increments too, even though he had just a tremendous amount of time, and the position was often pretty complex. So g4 is very gutsy. I mean, he's giving away his queenside, Bot is, and banking on his counterplay against against the black king. All right, black took. Thank you very much. 2 extra pawns. Now for the moment, 3 extra pawns. Okay, g takes f5 happened. Rook to b1, king to g2. And here, Nakamura went astray. I'm not sure if it was the losing move yet, but maybe practically speaking, it's pretty close to the losing move. So the right move here is king to g8, just getting out of the way. and after f6, bishop to f8, and it looks as if white's probably losing here. I mean, he still has plenty of fight in the position, but objectively speaking, it seems that he's losing now. So just to give one example, say he plays h3 to keep the black queen off of g4 in some variations, queen e6, and here he's losing the f-pawn. And you can see that black's king's position, maybe for the first time in the game, looks really quite snug. So white should do whatever he can to try to break things open on the king side, but it looks like black has it under control. So I wouldn't bet my life or anything on the claim that black is winning, but certainly in good shape, especially here with the c-pawn running rapidly down the board. So there may be some way that white can improve on this, but I think as a general evaluation, this king to g8 and then bishop to f8 idea seems to be quite strong. So it keeps lines closed. The pawn on f6 is, in a way, even an impediment for white because now the long diagonal is shut, and white's king is a little bit exposed. Black's got these two queenside passed pawns. So if black is indeed winning, it's really not all that surprising if that's the case. All right. Well, instead, Nakamura played g5, and this looks natural. I mean, f6 is impossible for white because it looks like you can just take the pawn, and keeps the f-file closed. And it's also maybe threatening to play queen f4 too. So it looks as if everything is really just coming up roses here. Maybe another possibility too is g4 to keep white's queen off of h5. But it turns out that this is really an error, and I don't know if it was a tactical error on Nakamura's part or a strategic error, but it turns out very badly after f6. All right, so this is opening up those light squares all over again. So not only is h5 possible, but queen coming to f5, where it hits h7. You can see the rook maybe coming to d7, and black has got serious trouble with his king. Well, not all of a sudden. I mean, he's had king problems in general to worry about for quite a while, but now they're really threatening. So it's not just that the king is exposed, but now the king is exposed and may die. So here, bishop takes f6 is more or less forced, and now queen to f5. And he played this move with 3 seconds left before finishing it. So right now he's got 33 seconds after the increment. And Nakamura still has a full hour. But this is a position where he needs that hour because his king is in desperate trouble. All right, now here he makes another error, does Nakamura. He should play... Actually, again, this is a good place for you guys to stop it and figure out what to do. I mean, it's an excellent exercise in this position to try to figure out how to save a position like this that looks just horrible, but in fact does still have some significant resources. Okay, so you guys have probably taken a 10-minute break here working things out. I hope you did. And again, perhaps Nakamura should have done that himself, but I think there's a trap that you can fall in when your opponent is in time trouble, and especially permanent time trouble, as we have here, since there's no, there wasn't going to be any bonus other than the increments the rest of the way. And it's that, it's just, you don't want to give your opponent time to think, so you're trying to, not necessarily rush, you're not trying to move as fast as he does, but you still have a tendency, or at least all of us, I think, have at least that inclination to just try to move too fast, because we think, okay, if I use all of my time, my opponent's going to be thinking on my time too, and that's going to more or less negate the time trouble that he's under. And all I can say is that's just a mistake. The one time where that is a reasonable policy is if you're dead lost. Okay, so if you're dead lost, then all right, it's okay to try to be a little bit tricky and to rush your opponent and to get him to blitz into blundering. But as long as your position is still okay, or it's potentially defensible, you should use your time. All right. If your opponent thinks on your time, okay, that's life. But you want to make the best moves that you can. I mean, if your position is good on its own merits, then don't screw it up trying to put the other guy over on the clock, especially since, the guy always does have his increments, so he's not going to just lose on time, most likely. Okay, well, at any rate, Nakamura didn't make the best use of his time, perhaps, and played the move rook to b2. And this looks this looks natural. I mean, for one thing, he avoids, there's various possibilities involving this. So the rook moves up and gives check, for example, or plays rook to d6, and then it looks as if it's very, very problematic for black. Or rook to d7 check. So rook to b2 is natural from that perspective. And I think he also has the idea of sacking the exchange and then maybe playing queen to f4, which essentially happens in the game, trying to swap off to an opposite, well, not to an opposite bishop, but to a rook versus bishop and pawns ending, where all he needs to do is make sure that the h-pawn gets exchanged off, or at least can't advance, and then he can hold the game. But the better way to play, well, okay, there's also another false trail. So rook to b7 looks really natural to stop rook to d7. But in fact, this isn't very good. After rook to d6, threatening the bishop, queen c3, queen d5 check, hitting the rook, king e7, white plays rook to e6 check, and black can resign. Because if the king moves to f7, trying to keep tabs on the rook, so that way if queen takes b7, there's king takes e6, white just plays rook to e3 check. And otherwise, if black doesn't play king to f7, then white's going to take the rook on b7 and just win. Alright, so the best move here was rook to b4. And this, again, has that idea of trading queens, but in a more favorable version. Alright, so the first thing to see is that rook to d7 check is really kind of a blank shot. I mean, black can, I think, just play king to e8, and everything is covered. And because he's threatening both queen to e4 and queen to g4, trading off the queens, white doesn't really have time to save the rook and maintain his attack both. Of course, also if queen takes f6, then the rook hangs on d7. And finally, notice that if queen takes h7, which is a blunder, black plays queen to g4 check, and then picks off the rook, winning easily. Okay, so after rook to b4, white's best is probably queen h7. And this is essentially going to be a perpetual or perpetual-ish. Okay, so here this is basically the only way for black to avoid it, but white regains his pawn deficit and achieves a draw easily in this way. Okay, so the game is rook to b2, check, and now king to g8. And this is a pretty incredible position. It looks as if black should just be getting mated in 3 or 4 moves here at most, but where is it? It's actually not even there. If he plays queen takes f6, note that that's a blunder. So it looks good because we're threatening mate, we've taken a piece, and we're threatening the rook on b2. But the problem is that queen to g4 check wins, king f1, and we move the rook out of the way too, and now we take white's rook. And there's also no perpetual check because if the queen checks on d5, we block on f7 with check. Or if queen to d8, queen f8, again with check. So this would just be losing for white. So black played queen takes h7 check, king f8, and again, it's like some kind of optical illusion. But there really is no way for white to deliver mate here. So bot retreated to f5, and now, of course, king to g8 is not playable because queen g6 and then mate next move. Well, not next move. Okay, mate in two more moves. Okay. In the game he played rook takes f2 check, king takes, queen f4, and so on. But there are a couple of mistakes in those 2 moves. So first, after queen f5, again, if you really want to give yourself a challenge, try to figure out what black should play here. It's not at all easy to find, but he did have a resource. And frankly, I mean, I think Nakamura is a strong enough player that if he had slowed down, he probably could have worked it out. Okay, not 100% guarantee, but probably could have. But again, I suspect he was really just trying to blitz out moves, and it didn't work out. Okay, so assuming you've tried to work it out, the right move is queen to c3. So again, a remarkable move for two reasons. I mean, one is that, well, it protects the bishop on f6. It seems to just completely give up the light squares. And secondly, the queen now has no checks against white's king. So it looks like white's queen can just go wherever it wants to, g6, e6, whatever, and simply win. But after queen to e6, rook f2, now all of a sudden, with the queen no longer pinning the bishop, black's pieces are all working very nicely, and in fact he has perpetual check. So just to give a few moves, here's one possible continuation. So g4 is actually very important. We need to clear out some of the lines so white can't hide behind black's pawn on the king side. And so with checks like that, it's a draw. And notice, of course, that white can trade queens with excuse me, with queen to f5, but this ending, now that white no longer has an h-pawn, pardon me, is easily drawn, and probably would be drawn even without the pawns. Though you have to be a little bit careful about that, because when the defender's king is close to the corner square that's the same color as the bishop, then he can get in trouble. So maybe not 100% sure that it's a draw, getting rid of the pawns. But with the pawns, it's dead drawn. All right, so queen to c3 is a very nice defensive resource that would have saved the game. Even after rook takes f2, king f2, it looks like king e8 would have saved it, though, this is definitely not a move that you make in a real game. I mean, unless you're, a genius, or you've analyzed it incredibly deeply, or you're using a computer. But while I think Nakamura could have found queen c3, I mean, it would have been challenging to work that out, but at least the calculation, I think, isn't so hard. It's really just having the idea. King e8, I think, is definitely much more computerish, but it seems to hold the game as well. And the weird point is that white is in kind of a quasi-Zugzwang here. I mean, if he moves the rook, let's say, to a7, then queen d4 check, and lo and behold, all of black's pieces start to get active. And so white has to find some way of making progress, but without hanging the rook on d7, and without allowing a whole new series of checks from black's pieces. And also, of course, king to e8 frees the bishop for bishop to d4 possibilities too. All right, so in the game, queen f4 happened, and it looks to me as if this ending is now lost. I mean, if there's some defense for black, I'm not able to find it. I think using Zugzwang, when necessary, white is going to be able to win all of black's pawns and ultimately reach a winning rook and h-pawn versus king and bishop ending, which is in fact what happens. All right, so let's suppose black tries c4, just to look at one way of trying to hold on to the pawn, or at least one of the queenside pawns. So rook a7, and now a couple of possibilities. So if we try bishop to b2 to anchor the pawn and bishop together, and also have the bishop where it controls the queening square, white takes, plays c3. Okay, we play rook c5. Of course, we can't allow c2. And the problem is, okay, if black just leaves the bishop on this diagonal, it's simply out of the game. So white will just slowly but surely advance the h-pawn and make progress over there. So let's try putting the bishop over here, where at least it's aiming at some squares that are relevant, like h6. All right, well, here we go. Check, h4, king g6, h5, and the pawn just goes. h6, h7, rook c8, and so on. So this is lost for black. All right, so that was on bishop to b2. If instead c3, again protecting the pawn with the bishop, but keeping the bishop close to home, let's see how this works out. All right, so here, again, black has to give ground. I mean, if he plays bishop to f6, white just plays h4, so that won't really stop anything. Okay, so now the problem, and this is going to arise later in the game. I mean, basically, black can't allow h6 check, or doesn't have to be check, but h6 followed by king to h5 is always fatal for black in this sort of ending. And the reason is that once the king gets to h5 and the pawn's still on the board, white will be able to follow up with rook c7, king g6, and so on, leading to a quick mate, or winning a winning promotion. So bishop to e3 would appear to be necessary. And then we're going to reach essentially the kind of ending we do in the game. So takes, bishop d2, rook c6, bishop e3. And again, let me challenge you to try to work this ending out, because it's quite a funny ending, and it looks, and it's quite hard to win it if, well, just kind of offhandedly. I mean, it does take some thought and some calculation at a few relevant moments. So see if you can figure out how white should finish this off before we proceed. All right. Well, here's the solution, or at least one solution. So king f5, bishop d2, and now, and this is what makes this ending so darn frustrating, h6 check. So we can actually give away the pawn in some variations. So the point is that after bishop takes h6, play rook to g6, king h7, king f6, followed by king to f7, and then utilizing Zugzwang, white's going to be able to make kind of a side row mate, or the win of the bishop. All right, we'll see a version of this later on in the analysis, so I won't proceed here just yet. Okay, so king h7, rook g6. Okay, so again, if this... All right, so actually, yeah, here we go. So this is where I had done it. So same situation. All right, so now white's idea, if it's white to move, it's very simple. We'll play rook to g3, and black does whatever, rook h3, and then we just waste a move, and the king has to give ground, and that's checkmate. So, black wants to try to hide with his bishop as long as he can. So after a move like bishop to a7, it's not immediately evident how white's winning. Because here, if he plays something like rook to g3, black plays king h6, and once he's out of the corner, it's a draw. I mean, rook versus bishop is a draw unless there's, again, some kind of forced tactical finish. All right, so rook a6, got to kick the bishop out if we can. Bishop b8, so trying to stay away as much as and as long as possible. Rook a8, again, bishop c7. But now after rook to c8, the poor bishop can no longer stay on these back two rows here. So, for example, bishop to f4, rook c4, there it is. Bishop there, again, trying to keep him out, but rook c3 does the job. Now you might wonder, well, why not bishop to b6 here? And that's a good question that you should try to figure out for yourselves. All right, well, remember what black's escape route was, right? So if white lets him get out, seemingly, he goes to h6. But if the king is on h6, well, then we've got a problem. Namely, the rook is going to be able to skewer these two guys. Well, not skewer, but fork these guys. So the answer is just rook to c3, threatening the mate, and stopping bishop to e3, so it's even nice from that point of view, too. And on king h6, rook c6 is the winner. Okay, so that's basically the idea. That's what white is headed for. And while black can delay it for quite a while, he can't ultimately prevent it. So the game continued like this. Bishop to c3, king takes f4, bishop to b4, king e4, rook c7. Okay, so that pawn's stuck. And now, okay, here white has to be careful, because if he pushes the pawn to h6 too early, that often just allows for an immediate draw. So the pawn can't go past h5 unless there are special circumstances. And with the white king so far away, that isn't one of them. So if black plays king to g8, white would need to switch gears. So the h-pawn has gone as far as it can, and here he needs to bring his king back over. So king e4, a4, king f5, and king g6. And now this is an easy win. So we're threatening mate in 1, and after king f8, h6, pawn's getting ready to promote. And here, there are probably a few ways for white to win, but the simplest is to check and then have this little interference motif. It's nice for white that h8 is not just queening, but it's also check, and in this case, mate. So if the king were somewhere else, let's say on e6, then black could play a2, h8, a1 queen, and so on. But here, this is decisive. All right, so black just staying passive is going to lose. So he plays bishop to d6. So that way his bishop can help in the defense. But of course now his pawns start to fall. So rook a7, a4, rook takes, king h7. All right, again, the unfortunate position of the bishop on the third rank, or sixth rank, black's third rank, shows up because white has the nice little check on a7. And if king h7, h6, rook a6 wins. So king g8, king takes c3, and now we're in table-based land. And I should say that Bot played this ending incredibly accurately. So I mean, I think just about everything he did earlier was pretty much perfect, and he continues to play perfectly, really through just a couple moves before the end, where he has one repetition before finding the right move. So really outstanding technique by Bot in this ending. Okay, bishop to f8. Of course, the next few moves are obvious. We're going to zip the king to g6 if we can. And now we see why black needed to bring his bishop back. So we can play bishop to g7 and king h7. Okay, so king e4, king h7, king f5, king h6. And now, okay, it may again seem hard to see how white's going to win this. But Bot played a very good move here. Actually, this wasn't necessarily the fastest move, but it was fine. He sees the right idea. So he plays rook to b7, bishop c3. And now, again, you might think, well, I have to play king g4, but not so. Rook to b6 check. It's a very nice move. Again, exploiting various mating ideas. So if king takes h5, rook to b3, bishop e1, check, and again we waste a move with rook h1, and the bishop falls. Okay, so black plays king to h7, and once again we have our puzzle here. So how does white win this position? So this is our final stoppage, I would say, for the lecture. Okay, well, what he needs to do is to put his king on g5. I mean, this is what white wants. King g5, h6, and if he does this without losing the pawn, life is good. Easy win at that point. Okay, well, here he can't play king to g5. I mean, he can, but bishop to d2 check, and white has achieved nothing. So he plays rook to d6. Now, it might not really seem like this is any big deal. I mean, it's a big diagonal from c1 to h6, and it would seem very likely that black's bishop could find some square from which it could safely check. But it turns out that it's not really so easy. All right, so first of all, let's see what happens if he does nothing. King g7. Again, we check. Play king g5. And then rook d7, king g6 with mate coming. All right, if he plays bishop to g7, well, once again, h6. I'm sorry, bishop to g7. Now you don't play h6, but you play king to g5 safely. There's no safe bishop check. So the only move that's left for black is bishop to b2. And now white plays rook to c6. Okay, well, again, black only has the one square on the diagonal from which he can give a check on the next move if white plays king to g5. That's bishop to d4. That is, safely check. Okay, and now Bot didn't figure it out the first time, so king e4, bishop g7, king f5, bishop d4. And here we have one last move in the game, after which Nakamura resigns. So, can you find it? Well, you might think it's h6, but if you play h6 right away, there's bishop to e3. So what Bot played is very nice, king to f4. So now h6 is a threat, and it turns out that the bishop has got no place to go on the diagonal. So c3 is covered by the rook. b2 doesn't do any good because the rook covers c1. And e5, of course, it hangs. f6, it hangs to the rook. Bishop h8, well, there's no checks to be given there. The next move. And on bishop to g7, well, let's see what happens there. Bishop to g7, king g5. No follow-up. So bishop d4. And then either rook c7, or if we want to be thematic, h6 and king h5, followed by a rook check on the 7th rank. So very nice technique by Bott. Tremendous resourcefulness on his part, saving a game where he's down an hour and 10 minutes, and doesn't even have time to get a drink of water. And to play that way for 50 moves, I mean, is really an outstanding an outstanding achievement on his part. So a good fighting game by both players. It wasn't a game where one side just had the advantage all the way and slowly but surely managed to convert it, but in fact a game where both sides had their chances. Both players took serious risks to fight for the full point, and I think it was well rewarded in a really exceptional game. So I hope you enjoyed it. Next week we'll be back with the 4th place game, and meanwhile, take a look at my blog, chessmind.powerblogs.com. Hope you'll enjoy what's there. So thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.